The room was cold, and metal walls hummed with the pulse of a ship that never slept, and I was alone on the deck, cleaning up the aftermath of another failed diplomatic exchange, when she arrived, or rather when she appeared in a shimmer of energy that whispered across the air like static that wanted to scream, and my mind had seconds to process her presence before she was in front of me, breathing my name, though I never told it to her, and I saw her eyes, not the usual black of her kind, but something ancient, something red, not of anger, but of fire and hunger and claim, and in that moment I knew she had not come to speak or to parley. She came to end something or begin something, and I froze as her hands gripped my shoulders and her mouth came close, not in affection, not in violence, but in that sharp moment where the line between the two ceases to matter, and she bit into my neck with the force that was not pain, but revelation, and I felt heat and ice, and something older than war and peace flow into me, a scream carved into the marrow of stars, and it lasted seconds or lifetimes, because time had no meaning as the ship blinked red, and the AI screamed warnings it didn't understand. And when she pulled back, she whispered one word, not in her tongue or mine, but in the shared language of blood and breath and broken chains. She said mine, and I fell to my knees, not from weakness, but from understanding that nothing would ever touch me again unless it wanted to die screaming. Medical scanned me for hours, and the crew avoided my eyes, and the commander said nothing at the tribunal because there was no rule for what had happened, only guidelines and myths. And after they ran every test they could think of, and some they had to build from scratch, they said I wasn't fully human anymore. They said my blood held markers that had no entry in any database, and my nerves pulsed with echoes of subspace, and my heart beat a rhythm older than our sun. And none of that mattered, because she returned that night without warning, standing in the same spot in the corridor, her cloak like shadow and starlight, and she looked at me with something that might have been regret or pride, and said I had changed more than I knew. And I asked her what she had done, and she said I had been chosen. But the choosing goes both ways. And I said I didn't remember choosing anything. And she said, your soul did, when you refused to kneel when I arrived. When you looked at me with fury, not fear. And when I sank my teeth into your neck, and tasted not just your blood, but your defiance, I knew you were mine. And I was yours. And that meant the stars would not be the same again. And I said, I never asked for this. And she said neither did the first mountain struck by lightning, but it still changed the world. The next time we docked, the station was already quiet, and I thought it was abandoned. Until we realized it had been emptied before our arrival. The comms replayed one message in 600 dialects warning of contagion. But it was not disease. It was her and me, the whisper of what we were now spreading across channels faster than light and systems burned their own jump gates to keep us out. And I asked her why they feared her so deeply, and she said, they do not fear me, they fear what you made me become, because I was once a blade forged to serve. But when I tasted you, remembered, I was meant to rule, and you reminded me that hunger does not make monsters, only those who deny it do. And I said, then what does that make us? And she looked at me and said, not monsters, not rulers. We are the storm, and we will not ask for welcome. We will be the truth that stands when lies retreat. And I felt it again, the pulse in my blood, the ache in my bones, as if gravity had shifted around me, and I knew we could never return to before, because before had been small, and now the galaxy was shrinking from us as if afraid to be seen. We went where conflict boiled and ended it without weapons, without declarations. We walked into war zones, and the fire stopped not from surrender, but from awe or terror or worship. And sometimes they knelt, and sometimes they fled, but never again did we meet resistance that did not shatter at first contact. And the old empires began to call us harbingers and ghosts and fate walkers. But we did not speak in prophecy, we only lived in certainty. And she taught me how to walk between screams and silence, how to make the air speak without words, and when I moved through battlefields untouched, it was not magic, it was truth. My blood screamed with her mark, and hers pulsed with mine, and together, we were something no sensor could classify and no weapon could measure. And still she kept close, never more than a breath away, as if my presence grounded her. And I realize, in moments between shadow and starlight, that her hunger had not faded, only evolved. And I was not afraid, I was awake. For the first time in a universe that now blinked first. When we started, they tried once to stop us. A coalition of 13 species gathered in secret beneath the crust of a dead moon, sending assassins and null walkers and mind burners and things that should not exist. And each one failed, not because we killed them, but because they saw us and forgot how to fight. Some turned to stone, some vanished in screams, some dropped their weapons and begged us to take them with us to make them like us. But we said no, not from cruelty, but because this bond was not transferable. It was forged not in rituals or science, but in the act of choosing and being chosen, of offering the neck and bearing the mark. And she looked at me that night as we stood on the glass plains where the council once plotted, and said they never understood that we are not tyrants, we are not gods, we are the answer to a question they were too proud to ask. And I asked her what the question was, and she said, how do you stop running? And I held her hand and said, you turn and walk forward and let the stars decide who follows and who disappears. Eventually, there were no more councils, no more resistances, no more curious scouts or defiant broadcasts, only silence on every band. A hush that stretched across entire sectors, and she smiled, not in triumph, but in understanding that we had become the new constant, a force, not born to rule, but impossible to ignore. And I felt peace, not the kind that comes from stillness, but the kind that grows from knowing you have been seen and chosen and changed. And she stood beside me as always, her fingers brushing my neck as if still remembering the moment her teeth first marked me. And I asked if she would ever let me go, and she said I could leave any time, but the universe would not know what to do without us now. And I realized it was true, because every chart had changed, every law rewritten, every species that once called itself sovereign now circled our shadow from afar, and some called it fear, and some called it reverence. But it was really recognition that something had emerged from the edge of extinction from a single moment of contact from one human and one predator who dared to see each other not as enemies, but as anchors. And I leaned into her and said mine, and her eyes burned gold, and she said always. It began with whispers, not from ships or empires, but from children born after the silence, children who did not remember the wars or the fear, only the stories of two figures who walked like storms and never raised their voices, but ended all conflict. And I saw them once, a group of them, wide-eyed and unafraid as they approached us, not with weapons, but with questions, and I knelt so I could hear them better, and they asked, what are you really? And she answered before I could, we are what happens when fear meets love and cannot survive. And the children nodded, not because they understood, but because they believed. And I felt something loosen in me, something ancient and tight, and I realized we had carried more than power, more than names. We had carried the weight of every unspoken hope and every buried question that dared to ask if the strong could protect without conquering, if the broken could heal without forgetting. And when I looked at her under the twin suns of a world that once hunted her species, I saw her smile, not the smile of a predator or a queen, but of someone who had found home, not in a place or a people, but in a single soul. And she reached for my hand, not as a symbol, not as a gesture, but as truth. And I said, what do we do now? And she said, we rest, we walk, we let the galaxy remember, not just what we were, but what we chose to be. And in that moment, the stars above flickered like breath, like heartbeat, like the universe itself was exhaling. And I knew the story would spread, not because we told it, but because something in the silence would always carry the echo of a bite.